Welcome back to the CleanTechies podcast, where we interview ClimateTech founders and VCs to discuss all things building and investing to solve the biggest challenge of our generation, climate change. On this episode, I had a chance to speak with Iris from Extantia, who is the head of science of a VC firm investing mainly in hardware and deep tech. Not only do they make direct investments in companies, they also have a fund-of-funds strategy where they look to build their thesis in the broader venture capital world. Iris herself is a chemist by training and shares a lot about her experience going from science to venture. I found myself learning a lot about what it meant to be intentional about that transition and also what made her a successful venture capitalist. I also think there's some great insights, especially related to hardware investing and how we can make that the norm in climate tech. As always, let us know your favorite parts when you finish listening and enjoy the episode. Really quick before you start listening, throughout the episode I mispronounced Extantia, but was able to correct it about halfway through. I apologize in advance, and thank you so much for listening. Hey Iris, how are you?
Good. How are you, Samuel?
Doing well. I'm super glad to have you on the show.
Likewise.
So today we're joined by Iris. I'm super excited for this episode. Iris, can you start off by telling the audience a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yes, of course. So I'm essentially a chemist by background who turned to the dark side. So it sounds a bit dark, but I started off once as a chemist in academia, actually. And I was working for a while on processes to convert carbon dioxide into sustainable fuels. And eventually found my way to the dark side, also known as venture capital, but with good intentions. I wanted to make a significant dent in climate change. And currently, I'm head of science at the ClimateTech venture capital firm Extantia here in Berlin, Germany. And head of science is probably quite an uncommon position for a venture capital fund. So maybe let's start off with with a bit more information on what that actually means. So at Extantia, we want to solve big problems in climate. And what does that mean, a big problem in climate? For us, a big problem in climate is any sector that emits at least 1 gigaton CO2 equivalents per year. Now, before we invest at Extantia, we ask ourselves the question, is this company or technology addressing these big problems? If the answer is no, we don't proceed. And if the answer is yes, we're curious to explore further. So essentially, because of our emission savings mandate, we almost exclusively invest in hardware, which is also super uncommon for a venture capital fund. To be a bit more specific, think about topics like e-fuels, hydrogen, biogas, CO2 conversion generally. And this is why I, as a chemist by background, am deeply involved in the investment decision-making process of a venture capital fund. And it's not just investment bankers sitting at the table here on our end.
Impact brands represent the choice to live our lives in alignment with planetary action and our values, to preserve our amazing home for generations to come. Be it through solar panels, how you travel, where you're sourcing your materials, the choices we make matter. And I know you know that if you're listening to this podcast. My name is Anna Konstantinova, and I'm on a mission to make impact brands our next paradigm. I believe that marketing can be used for us rather than against us, and I want to help you build the best brand possible so we can all pour our strength into solving the biggest issue of our time. Whether you're a founder or an investor representing portfolio companies, let's work together to make sure your brand is seen, heard, and remembered the way it deserves to be. And as a thank you to the CleanTechies community, I'm offering 20% off my newest launch, Branding Sessions, with code CleanTechies, one word. We'll take 60 or 90 minutes to solve one specific problem, whether it be a naming issue, strategy development, business growth, or beyond. Let's put our minds together and move forward with renewed energy. Can't wait to hear what you're working on. Find me at anako.co. That's ANNAKO.co. Talk soon.
Can you talk a little bit about being a chemist and which technologies you actually interact in evaluating the most? Because climate is big. You mentioned a lot of different topics. Are there specific ones where you as a chemist are best positioned to evaluate?
Yes, and maybe touched upon that a little bit already. So the conversion of greenhouse gas carbon dioxide is a topic that I was also working on during my academic years. So anything that falls in that, under that umbrella. So think about, for example, converting carbon dioxide to e-fuels, which is an investment we've already done, or converting carbon dioxide to anything that's, let's say, more valuable than the greenhouse gas itself. That are topics that I guess I'm well positioned for. But also, for example, the synthesis or the creation of fertilizer. It works via a similar chemical process, just with a different molecule, let's say. So anything, any process that converts one compound into another compound is something that, that works well. And also topics like biogas, hydrogen, is something that I feel well positioned for as a chemist. There are obviously also other topics that are maybe, where I'm not the best person to assess. So think of nuclear fusion, which would be better for a physicist, or think about anything related to biology, like microbiology. For example, lab-based meat or lab-grown meat is also a topic that I would say we need a biologist to help us assess whether this is a good deal or not.
I think you can definitely see some of the scientific humility and the way that you describe these technologies. Sometimes, sometimes we'll talk to people who will understand the technology but not know enough to really get the full of it, but still feel comfortable making a decision. Which to each their own. But it's really cool to see how much you're aware of how much you know and don't know. And my family, I have an academic in my family, so I definitely relate to hearing that growing up. Well, let's double click on one of those. You talked about going from a chemist to the dark side in VC. So what actually motivated you to make that decision? More importantly, like, how did you decide, okay, straight from academia into, a totally different field?
Yeah, good question. Love to touch upon that a little bit. So during my academic times, I also spent some time in Silicon Valley on the West Coast, which is, of course, the birthplace of venture capital. So while I was living there, even though I was a chemist working at a university, that of course I couldn't avoid interacting with venture capital at some point in time, because it's just all over the place. And back in these days, so in 2017, I felt like venture capital was mostly focused on software investments, maybe a little bit of biotech here and there. But even though I really like the concept of, let's say, investing and supporting a startup to grow, I couldn't see how I, as a chemist, would add value there. So just continued down the research, the academic path, and then only at the beginning of 22, so now a bit more than, a year and a half ago, a bit more, I realized that venture capital was actually going in the direction of climate tech, and lots of climate tech is related to chemistry and chemical engineering. So that created a new sort of re-sparked my interest for venture capital, and I started looking into the topic. And back then, Extantia, the fund I currently work for, was looking for a head of science, so a science person to actually join the fund and sort of fill that gap of being able to assess the technology in more detail. So that's how eventually, kind of randomly found my way into venture capital again.
Hey there. Are you building a climate tech business and looking for very specialized talent? Consider reaching out to our sponsors, NextWave Partners. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you're looking to make a career change yourself, feel free to reach out to NextWave at next-wavepartners.com or reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page.
Your story is probably like one of the more exciting stories, because we hear from a lot of different people that you need subject matter experts on the founder side, but then the people who have subject matter experts on the venture side also can speak to like the different technologies, the things that they know, and coming at it just from a little bit more of an informed angle in climate, where you do have to evaluate things with a little bit more of a deep tech hardware focus. So it's super cool to see that was how, you came about thinking about venture. When you made that transition, the initial impression of what venture capital was with, Extantia as their head of science, what was your understanding of why they were looking for a head of science and how you were meant to integrate into their operations?
Yeah, good question. I think so generally, what they were looking for in a head of science was also maybe a little bit undefined when they were still looking for one. So this type of role, you see it now more often coming by in sort of hardware climate tech funds, like that a science person actually joins the fund. And that role can go into multiple directions. So that science person can either decide, okay, I'll really only take the research side of things. I'll maybe do some tech due diligence, and I won't be involved with the investment process so much. But for me, I'm quite a curious person by nature, and it became clear that I wouldn't be able to do the research without interacting with these portfolio companies or these potential investment targets, because I felt it was really out of context otherwise, me just doing the research but not talking to the entrepreneurs. So let's say quickly my role developed into being basically for 60% of my time on the investment team, and for about, let's say, anywhere between 20 to 40%, depending on how busy it is, doing research, doing technical due diligence assessments, these kind of things. So yeah, I would say I'm integrated in the investment team as a member there as well. But yeah, it could go anyway, depending on what you feel more comfortable with as a science person. So.
And I think this is probably a little more of a granular question, but when you're evaluating investments, where in that process does evaluating the science come in? Because there's a number of reasons you could reject a company. It could be out of thesis. It could be a technology that you don't know or align with. But there's different levels at which you evaluate that, right? So at what point in time are you evaluating the science?
Good question as well. So I think evaluating the science starts for us already relatively early in the process. So maybe not, let's say, in an introductory call with a startup, we'll mostly be focusing on, can they save a lot of CO2 emissions? And this is the kind of top level approach that everybody in the investment team can do. Also, the people without science background can do this assessment. And then probably during a second or a third call is when we really start looking into the science in more detail, especially if it's an early stage company, if it's a seed stage company. Sometimes, they just came out of the lab, and we do need to know whether this, what they're developing makes sense, and whether sort of the science behind it is de-risked, because we're investing in the commercialization of a technology and not in an R&D project. So I guess the science comes in two different angles. Like, first of all, does this technology make sense? Is it true what they're saying? Can we validate the claims? And then also, second, are they ready for commercialization, or are they still at R&D phase, and is it too early for us? So.
Hey there, thanks for listening to this episode. If you made it this far, it's likely that you're enjoying the show, so I wanted to ask your help. If you're enjoying it, please give us a review on Apple Podcasts and share with somebody in the same industry who might find this interesting. And if you're interested in getting summaries of these episodes, go subscribe to our newsletter that comes out on LinkedIn and Substack. Links can be found in the description. Thanks for your help in growing the reach of this show.
Can you talk a little bit about that second part? Because the first part, it makes sense. Is it real, right?
Yeah.
And does it work?
Yeah.
So that
does it work?
Is a little more binary. But how are you evaluating? And this is obviously broad. So this may not be a very straightforward answer, but at a high level, how are you evaluating whether a science is commercializable?
Yeah. So whether a science is commercializable, I mean, we can speak, for example, in terms of technology readiness levels. So I'm sure that's a term you've heard before. So when typically the technology readiness level scale goes from 1 to 9, and then 1 to 3 means R&D, 4 to 6 means pilot stage, and then 6 to anywhere up to 9 is basically commercial or ready to be commercialized. So for us, when something is below TRL 4, that basically means it's still a research project and it's not ready for commercialization. And maybe to make it a bit more like tangible, for us, it means there has to be a prototype that actually is working, there are data from the prototype, and the science is de-risked. So they're not working on a fundamental question anymore, but they're working on optimization of the process, and they actually have a prototype that is, doing something at gram or at watt scale already, instead of, let's say, milligrams or milliwatts.
Okay. So I think, that's been a super, super great, helpful overview of like how science is integrating into all of that. I just want to, before we move on, definitely circle back to you and say, it's super cool to hear how your thought processes factor into the traditional venture system. Again, like you said about the second or third call, you're inserting very early on into the process. How has your thinking changed? Because I think that is something that happens to people when they enter venture, or they even become a founder to a smaller degree. They start thinking about problems differently. They see things from a different point of view. So how do you feel your thought process has changed since, looking maybe at things from a more commercializable or financial point of view?
So I think how my vision has changed since moving into venture capital. Coming from the academic side, you're very much taught to always understand every single detail before making any claim whatsoever. Like, you can't make an assumption without knowing for sure whether it's correct. And that has completely changed for me moving into venture capital. So I had to start being comfortable with not knowing everything. So I had to sometimes step back, where I'm like, wait, I am not the scientist on the team. I am the scientist at Extantia, and that means that I only have to sort of assess what they're doing to a certain level. Like, I cannot know all the details, because I don't need all these details to make an investment decision. But sometimes I had to get back to a bit of a higher level and really pull myself back, like saying to myself, I know you're curious, but you cannot understand all of these details because you need to move on. There's more things you need to do today, you know? So that has definitely changed. Yeah, maybe it's also a personality trait that when I still was in academia, I was sometimes feeling myself being, I always liked so many different things. You know, I was a very curious person, had sometimes too many things running at the same time. And that's not always the best sort of personality trait to have when you're in academia, because you need to go really deep into one topic, right? But now in venture capital, it's actually helping me so much during my daily job that I'm interested in many things because, yeah, my day is many things. Like sometimes in the morning, I will have a call about nuclear fusion, and then in the afternoon, I need to talk about biogas or lab grown meat, you know, so you need to switch quickly. And if you don't like that, then venture capital is not your type of job, I would say.
What helped you prepare for that dynamic of a workload and that dynamic of a lifestyle?
What helped me prepare? That's a good question. I mean, you know, the politically correct answer would be to say I've done a minor in business and entrepreneurship, and that helped me a lot. But the truth is that that actually didn't prepare me at all for venture capital. When I started in venture capital, I felt very much like being thrown into the deep end. You know, like on my first day, one of my colleagues was like, "Hey, we have this call with the direct air capture startup. Do you want to sit in and just assess the technology?" And I was like, "Oh, wait, already? Okay, that's very fast. You know, I've just started." And so that's just how it went. But I have to be honest that I actually really enjoyed that. It was, you know, things were suddenly like things were moving, things were fast paced, and it really sort of matched this, yeah, I guess personality trait of being very curious and liking so many things where you're just moving. And I actually really enjoyed that, but I wouldn't be able to tell you that I was actually prepared for it, if that makes sense.
Hey there, thanks for listening to this episode. If you made it this far, it's likely that you're enjoying the show, so I wanted to ask your help. If you're enjoying it, please give us a review on Apple Podcasts and share with somebody in the same industry who might find this interesting. And if you're interested in getting summaries of these episodes, go subscribe to our newsletter that comes out on LinkedIn and Substack. Links can be found in the description. Thanks for your help in growing the reach of this show.
Yeah, I definitely understand that. I mean, you have the traditional archetype of founder to VC, and even then you
Yeah.
see a lot of, I mean, there's the whole running debate about, you know, founders being good at VC versus founders not being good at VC, and it's just not a one size fits all. It really just depends on the person and how much
Yeah.
they like what they're doing.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
a lot of the great mentors that I've had in venture, just most of them really love, I mean, hopefully all of them really love what they do. And I think that's one of the biggest driving factors of success
Yeah.
and perseverance. So that's super
No, that's
cool to
a
hear.
yeah. I think if you don't love what you're doing, it's going to be difficult to, you know, sustain and be really passionate about and invest your full self completely into it. So that's a good way to start.
Definitely. Well, you know, not just about this way of going about it in general, but I'd love to hear now about more what you do at Extania in specific. Extania has a lot of different programs, and
Yeah.
I think it's a really, really cool concept of how to go about commercializing technology that is outside of traditional software. So first, I think I'd love to just set the scene with having you talk about how Extania goes about looking at investments, specifically given your hardware focus.
Yeah. So how we started off, maybe let's start off with a little bit of a story, let's say, on like how this all came about and what kind of void we tried to fill with this fund as a concept. I think, yeah, if you go back in time a little bit, especially comparing, let's say, Europe, where I'm currently sitting, and across the pond in the US, where you're currently sitting, back in 2015, the actual founding partners of Extantia were already thinking about climate, and the Paris Climate Conference had just happened, and ClimateTech was slowly growing again. But in Europe, we were looking at North America, and we saw some investments come by in the climate space. But we wanted to create a firm like that in Europe as well, to really cultivate climate tech. And the sort of founding partners back in 2018-19, they realized that that was really missing and that a dedicated fund was needed. So not a mainstream fund, but a dedicated fund to sort of green or like climate investments. And not the ones that were saying, okay, we're like a green fund, but still doing 80 to 90% software. Because, yeah, very simply put, like greenhouse gases cannot be removed from the physical atmosphere with another app on your phone, right? So something was really missing. yeah, and that's how let's say eventually Extantia came about back in 2019. And first started off with a bit of a smaller fund because it was a bit risky and it felt a bit uncertain. Like we didn't know for sure if there was actually capital available for this kind of investing, because lots of people would tell you, okay, it's risky hardware, are you sure this is going to work, are we going to get financial returns? So back in 2020, 21, they first started off with a small pilot fund, which we call pledge fund, to sort of to figure out if there was any capital available for this idea at all. Like, could we unlock any specifically institutional capital to back these kind of ideas? That first fund is now all invested and actually worked out. So decided to raise a bigger fund called Flagship, which is our current direct investment fund. And with that fund, we have indeed unlocked some institutional capital. So because that's sometimes the slower capital. So think about like pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, anything with some form of stake money. Is typically a bit slower to unlock, but is actually really worth it in the long term. Let's say this works out well, that kind of capital hopefully feels more comfortable continuing investing like that in more sort of hardware-based climate solutions. And so with Flagship, we basically invest in seed and Series A startups in the ClimateTech space. But then apart from the direct investments in startups, we also found that sort of a real ecosystem with different financial sort of financial bodies was actually missing. So we decided to do a fund of funds as well. We call this All Stars, and our All Stars fund invests capital in other climate funds. And typically these other climate funds are complementary to what we are doing. So for example, in the food and agriculture space, we're not the strongest, let's say. We like the space, but we felt like we should get some more exposure and some more insights into that market. So we invested with our fund of funds, for example, in Astanor, which is a Belgian food and agtech fund. Or another example from fund of funds is Zero Carbon Capital in the UK, which is a very, very early stage fund that also does ClimateTech, but they do basically pre-seed and seed. So they do the really early things, which is actually very complementary to what we are doing. We love watching that as well, and seeing, let's say, our friends set up their funds as well in the climate space. So a lot of information to process, but long story short, 3 funds currently that we have under management with different, let's say different ticket sizes, different philosophies, and especially also that idea of setting up an ecosystem in the climate tech investment space is something that's quite unique to us, I would say.
Definitely. And I would love to just recap that to make sure I understand. One thing I just want to say to the audience, I apologize for the pronunciation. Extantia, is that correct?
Extantia, yeah, exactly.
Extantia.
All good.
Okay.
All good. Yeah.
I'll mention that in the beginning as well.
All good.
I'll get that right from here on out. So just so you saw this gap in the market, you had this theory that there would be a way to tackle these technologies, commercializing these technologies that people weren't really embracing truthfully because they were kind of hesitant or leaning more on the software side. And now, especially after Pledge, your first fund, you've been able to demonstrate success in that regard and move on to building out a bigger ecosystem.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good summary. Exactly. So that's where we are right now.
Okay.
Ecosystem is growing, and there's more and more interest from the market in things like that. Thanks.
And so before I dive into the specifics of Pledge and Flagship, you brought up a point about like being able to now talk to more institutional investors and just expand your investor base because you have some things to show for it. When you're in those conversations, do you find you are focusing more on convincing them that this is necessary, that hardware investing is necessary, or convincing them that, okay, you want to do hardware investing, we can do it well? Are you introducing them to the problem or showing that you're the person that can actually crack the code?
Good question. I think most people at this point in time are aware of the problem. So let's say greenhouse gases can't be removed from the atmosphere with an app or another software solution, right? That's the problem, and most people acknowledge that. But then the real gap or the void is where people want to invest more in it, but feel like they don't fully understand the risks. And that is where we indeed come in and tell them, hey, we know how to do it. We can sort of invest that capital in hardware-based climate solutions that actually have a big impact. And we can also get you financial returns, right? So that's the other sort of maybe third point that you didn't fully address yet, but that's lots of people think, okay, if I do hardware climate, it's like philanthropy. I won't get financial returns, but that's not the kind of financial product that we're putting on the market. So we believe, and we have also showcased already, that with investing in ClimateTech hardware, you can actually get really big financial returns if it goes well. There's a big potential to get financial returns, given that, you make sure the company doesn't rely on the green premium anymore further down the line. So they need to be able to compete with the fossil-based alternative in the market.
So can you talk a little bit about, just at a high level, whatever you're comfortable sharing, like how are you looking at the returns on hardware investments? Is it IPO? Is it acquisition? Is it partner, like just getting these large scale partnerships? How are you looking at what is a successful hardware investment?
So I think when we do our return analysis, there's typically two scenarios that we model. One of them is indeed IPO, as you mentioned. So the company goes public, and that's a way for us to get financial returns. And the other option is acquisition. So let's say a larger company in the space, or like a really big company, will buy this technology or this company, and that's a way for us to make that exit. And we generally, in some cases, it gets a bit blurry or a bit fluffy, because if like direct air capture, a topic that I was talking about before, there's not that many big exits yet. So what are you going to compare yourself to? What is your standard, right? But for things like that, it is a bit of an estimation in some cases, but we typically look at growth rates of, for example, the oil and gas industry, and we do make assumptions there, which sort of the chemist from academia comes out in me, and I feel a bit like uncomfortable sometimes with making assumptions, but you have to start somewhere, you have to do something. We sometimes include in some assumptions in that, for companies that it really are not, there's nothing in the market super big that you compare them to. So you have to make assumptions looking at, for example, how fast is oil and gas growing, and you translate that into the company that you're investing in and use that for your return analysis.
Got it. So it resembles a lot of the traditional models for software, for example, but just operates differently because you're not exactly using like high growth software. It's the thing that's scaling.
Yeah, it's a different kind of scaling, but although this is also a topic we can touch upon, because as you said, sort of the traditional software investing is like the hockey stick, right? So you invest and it grows really fast, and then you make a quick exit. Ideally for the venture capital fund, that would be like in 3 or 4 years, And this is maybe a little bit different for hardware, but we do think that there are things, and we know that there are things you can do to change that growth profile and to really sort of create a hardware company with a software growth profile. So for example, if you build a software company, before we started the podcast, you and I talked a little bit about the MVP, so the minimum viable product. And that's something that a hardware company, when they have that minimum viable product, they can do a similar, let's say, smokescreen test, or like a test to probe interest of the market by doing pre-orders, a pre-order agreement. So maybe to make it a bit more tangible, think, for example, about Tesla Model 3 and how they, even though the Tesla Model 3 wasn't there yet and couldn't be shipped out, they had the option to sign up as a pre-order for your car. This type of model is something that we also apply to one of our current portfolio companies. So Reverion is a company here in Germany working in the biogas space. And with their system, they're actually able to harvest twice as much energy from biogas compared to the current state of the art. And we realized, or actually the company realized, that lots of farmers here in Germany actually wanted to have a device like that because it would make total sense from an economical viewpoint. Like they could maximize their returns by 2x, which is, it's kind of like a no-brainer for them to buy the container. However, Reverion, the company, they didn't have the containers ready yet. So they felt a bit reluctant. They didn't know what to do with that interest. And then we came to them and we said, hey, let's try this pre-order thing that they did at Tesla. Let's see if it works out for us. So we did that. We made them do pre-order agreements with all the people that showed interest. And they're now at a point in time where they made a 90 million pre-order book. And they actually had to stop taking pre-orders because they basically couldn't promise delivery till like 2-3 years down the line. And this creates the type of, let's say, more hockey stick type of growth for a hardware company that you would normally not expect in this space.
That's an incredible story. I mean, I think that's exactly the problem that you see, which is you have to undertake this massive R&D cost, or at least at the very minimum, the cost that it takes to prototype something, and it's hard sometimes to financially justify it. So having that demand set out from the beginning is it seems like a very great solution to that problem.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Thanks.
What about the process do you think made it successful? Because someone could be listening to this and thinking, okay, pre-order solution, but how do you get those pre-orders? How do you establish those connections? Is that where specialists like Extantia really come in, where you're able to make those introductions? Or do you have any advice on how to establish the way to get those pre-orders?
Yeah, good question. So the way to get these pre-orders is definitely through connections, and that's indeed some of the things that we can do as a venture capital fund, because we're quite closely connected to, let's say, some of these companies in the chemical industry or any sort of industrial larger company. So these kind of introductions we can facilitate. Um, yeah, and generally, I mean, building the container and doing the R&D behind it, that is not something that we as a venture capital fund will do. So going back to the specific example of Reverion, they had actually built their very first container, so their minimum viable product, in the lab already based on the grants that they received. So they came out of the Technical University of Munich. And when we first started talking with them, they already were working on this first container. And that container, yeah, let's say once it was ready, they were actually already at TRL 5, maybe 6 when we invested. And with that container and sort of showcasing that container, they could through connections indeed get the pre-orders in. So I think connections is maybe the key word here, as you were already kind of mentioning.
Definitely. I think that's the reality of a lot of how the growth in the industry happens. For example, you talked about how there might not be that many IPOs in a space, but if there is, what happens is you have this recycling of talent where they can come back and help others. And so having a collection of talent like Essentia definitely makes sense why you're able to have that alpha
Yeah,
in your
yeah,
investing thesis.
yeah, exactly.
Super cool. And now, so I know we've talked a lot about the overarching narrative of how you hope to be successful. Could you tell me about why seed and Series A in hardware?
Yeah, of course, good question. So why seed and Series A in hardware? I think generally where we see, let's say, the type of talent that we like seeing in the startups that we're looking for, so the hardware is very often somehow related to a technical university. And we've seen sort of maybe the biggest problem or the biggest gap where the talent from university has done something really cool during their studies. So think about Reverion, they were already working on this container from, yeah, with the grants that they had at university. But for them with a technical background to come out and to commercialize that product, that's really what was still missing. And that type of stage is normally the seed stage where you come out of the lab, you have a product that's maybe TRL 4, 5, 6, but what are the next steps? Like, how are you going to commercialize this? How are you going to put it in the market? And that's where we feel as a team of, let's say, scientists, engineers, entrepreneurs, that we can help them do this, because some of us have been through that as well. And then, yeah, obviously Series A is like the next step. So that's, yeah, I guess like all venture capital funds, we just have a range of things that we can do and we can support. And we felt like seed and Series A is kind of our sweet spot.
One interesting dynamic is like the amount of capital that these companies might be asking for and thinking about. And so throughout your fundraising process, if you're serious about engaging with the company, you'd be able to provide advice on how large a round size should be, how much capital they need. Do you find you're often telling companies that they need more capital than they're asking or less capital than they're asking?
Good question. So more or less capital than they're asking. I think it's a bit hard to give one specific answer because it really varies. Like, it also depends on who are the people behind it. Like, sometimes people are generally more cautious, sometimes they are a bit more positive. So what we normally do before saying, hey, you should ask more or less capital, is look at the financial model with them, look at the forecasting. And indeed, in some of the cases, there's some capital missing. And yeah, sometimes that can be sort of filled up with extra equity, but in some cases we will tell them, hey, try to get some non-dilutive funding like a grant, so you can cover part of that capex and you don't have to, let's say, scare off investors by saying, hey, you're basically paying for my capex, right? And in some cases we also say, because we really like the milestone-based approach, so that you invest in a company and they have, let's say, a runway of maybe like 1.5 to 2 years. So we yeah, sometimes we tell them ask for less capital, make the milestones a bit smaller and a bit more precise. And then you can go out raising again next time with your milestones that you have accomplished in your hands. So I think, yeah, it's difficult to give a precise answer to your question. Are they asking for more or less capital? It depends really on the company and the people behind it, I would say.
It definitely makes sense. The reason I find that interesting is because the pulse on how hardware innovators see capital and how much they're estimating might give a sense of, how much is really needed to get some of these innovations to scale. So it makes sense that it's very diverse. I think it'd be really interesting over time to see if there's a trend of, are people oftentimes overestimating or underestimating how much it takes.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. Maybe we should start some statistics on this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, super cool about that. And one thing about the investment process that we haven't talked about, which is probably the last major component, which is how do you evaluate the decarbonization potential of the companies that you're interested in?
Yeah, good question. So how do we evaluate the decarbonization potential? I think typically, maybe I alluded to that a little bit in the beginning, everybody on the investment team, even if you're not technical by background, you can at least do a high level assessment. So for example, if we're looking at a technology in the aviation industry, we know that the general footprint of the aviation industry is X gigatons of CO2. So we know that that's the right sector to address. So that's maybe, let's say, the top level approach that everybody will take. And everybody on the investment team will be able to tell probably from a pitch deck already, hey, this solution will not make our carbon mass savings, or this solution will make our carbon mass savings. And we're going to proceed looking at it. Although sometimes there are some borderline cases where we have to spend a bit more time in seeing whether it makes sense or not. But that high level approach is actually the first step that we take typically even before an introductory call with the founders to see if this is a field that we will invest in. And then when it gets a bit more serious, so when we're actually proceeding with a term sheet, with moving forward with investment, we have someone working with us for about 1 day a week who's let's say a professor in this field. So Professor Francesco Pomponi works with us part-time, and he is actually doing a full LCA, so like a life cycle assessment on the CO2 emission savings. And that's more like not a top-down, but more like a bottoms-up approach, where he'll be talking to the founders, like very much in detail, extracting, for example, hey, are you using steel pipes for your setup? How much CO2 was needed to produce these steel pipes? And he will account for everything. And he will project, it's obviously these kind of calculations are predictions. So there's always assumptions that you make. And we know that in many of the cases, it might deviate from what we have predicted, but at least we have a bit of a ballpark figure idea of how much they can save up to 2050. So Francesco then models the scenarios in, let's say, positive, medium, and negative all the way up to 2050. And then we assess whether this has enough impact, which in most cases it has already passed the high level test. So it's just sort of a sanity check for us to have a bit of an idea. And then also, let's say, set targets with the company. When we invest, we set targets with them for all the years to follow. And these targets are actually also linked to the carried interest that we receive as investors at the fund.
I think that the breakdown of that is super interesting. I mean, I wouldn't have guessed that kind of analysis might be possible. It sounds like there's a lot of different viewpoints that are coming in to make that happen. I won't put you on the spot and ask you the most difficult part, but do any parts of that analysis stick out as this is just not that easy to approximate or calculate?
Ooh, good question. I think, yeah, what we typically do say about these calculations is that we know we are always wrong. So we're making predictions for up to like 20 to 25 years from now. So who knows what will change, right? So I think, yeah, generally the calculations are quite detailed, but we should also keep in mind that it could very well be that we're wrong in the end. So if there's any particular part that sticks out, yeah, it's more, let's say, what sticks out mostly is that we know in many cases it could be very different from what we have predicted.
And I think that's completely relevant because, if that did exist, you'd probably see a swath of ESG and carbon estimation companies go out of business because the solution would exist. But it is necessary, and it is interesting, always interesting to see how people are circumventing this ambiguity to try and estimate, how much impact the technology is having.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
I'd love to, pivot now into sort of getting to, I think, what could be really helpful for a lot of people who listen to the show. There's a lot of new fund managers in climate, and especially in these next couple of years, you're going to see a lot of people making investments. There's been, I think, $4 or $5 billion funds announced in the last like 4 to 5 months, something like that. So there's going to be a lot of people deploying capital. Do you have any advice? Look for fund managers who are looking at hardware. How do you get over the bias? And what are things that you should be looking for if you haven't made a traditional hardware investment before?
Yeah, good question. And actually, maybe first of all, I'm really happy to see that there's so much capital available in the market, because we need a lot of capital to actually, achieve the goals in climate and the goals in energy that we have for ourselves. And yeah, it's a big mission. So I'm happy to see that. I think for new fund managers that are going into the climate tech hardware space, it's super important to get some technical people on your team. So again, I don't think it should just be investment bankers doing these type of deals, but it should also be people with a STEM background. So people from like chemistry, like myself, or like engineering or physics, that are actually helping to assess the technology. Because you just want to make sure that something works when you invest, and you want to make sure that it'll be able to stand alone. So without, let's say, the green premium, it should be price competitive with the fossil-based alternative. And coming to conclusions like that, it's generally good to have, I think I would say, a bit of a team with diverse backgrounds. So not just the scientist or the engineer or the chemist, but also people that know more about business, and that can help on that front. And yeah, I think what we also generally have here, so for example, you mentioned ESG already as a topic. We have a full-time head of ESG here at Extantia. We have a full-time head of marketing. We have a professor that works with us on the carbon math. And yeah, we have engineers, entrepreneurs. So the team generally has completely different mindsets. And sometimes I'll be joking around, for example, with our head of marketing, that I see the world in molecules and atoms, and she sees the world in like fonts and like presentation styles and things like that. And this sort of diversity of thought is something that's actually very important for coming up with quite creative ideas in the climate tech space, I would say.
And so for the person who's like, I could be that person, I could be that talent that the VC needs, you obviously made that transition. Part of it was you adapted the lifestyle very well. How could someone position themselves from a traditional scientific academia background to get the opportunity to get into venture?
Yeah, good question. So how to get from, let's say, a more scientific academic background into venture capital? I think, first of all, as I said in the beginning, you have to maybe ask yourself if it's the type of job that suits your character, because as I said, I'm generally quite curious. I like many different things at the same time. So I don't mind the quickly switching that you have to do in venture capital. But if you say, okay, that's something that I would really like, then start broadening your horizons, start talking to people that have made that transition, like reach out to them on social media to ask if they're up for a coffee or an online chat, so you can get a bit more of a feeling for what are the things that you should do. Like in my case, the fund was looking for a more scientific person to join. So I was maybe also, it sounds maybe a bit, maybe not what people want to hear, but I was at the right place at the right time, right? So that also helped. And sometimes it's also serendipity. So to sort of increase the chances of being at the right place at the right time, start reaching out to people, start talking, and maybe there is a right time and a right place. You just need to find it. So sometimes you can help, like, push the serendipity a little bit, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly said. It's always tough to know right time, right place, but you can always put yourself in a position to be at the right place at the right time. Whereas if you stay complacent, it might not be as possible. So I really
push your luck a little bit.
Create your own luck. I think it's called.
Exactly.
Super. And so now switching a little bit to the founder side, one thing I wanted to ask you is, you go through evaluating a lot of these technologies, you work in both science and investments, you have a lens on both. As a founder who's building, let's say, their pre-seed deck, their seed deck, what are your pieces of advice to them to how to make their technology presentable to investors?
Yes, so how to make their technology presentable to investors, that maybe first of all starts a bit with asking yourself, who do I want my investors to be? Because there are different types of investors that you could target. if, for example, you think about a ClimateTech fund like ours, things that we want to see in your deck is how much CO2 can you save? Because that's literally what we're looking for as our first principle when deciding to invest or not. And I'm saying that from our perspective, but many impact funds that are more like a generalist impact fund will also look for things like this. So let's say, how many emissions can you save? And how is your technology better than what's currently out there in the market? So yeah, maybe to make it a bit more tangible with like energy as an example. So let's say you're building a technology that generates clean energy. Like, how much better is this compared to what we're doing right now? Talk in percentages, in watts, like in actual numbers, let's say, something tangible, something quantifiable. And maybe because you mentioned a pitch deck specifically, so when it's about a pitch deck, less is more, really less is more. Like, people that are going to be assessing your deck are generally going to be quite busy, and they're going to want to decide in a few minutes whether they will schedule an introduction call with you. So make sure that, let's say, if you're targeting a climate or an impact investor, that this type of information that their fund is looking for, which typically you can find it on their website, that is in your deck. You need to make sure, know your audience, kind of. You need to, yeah, and it's fine to have, let's say, one general pitch deck that you send out, but make sure to adapt it or tweak it a little bit based on the type of investor you're looking for.
And how about on the seed and Series A side? So you've established somewhat of a viable technology. You've shown that it has potential. You're now really struggling with the go-to-market and how to commercialize it either better or in a different manner. So do you have any advice for people to what kind of ways can they really like rethink that the way they're going about commercialization, go-to-market, finding product market fit, things like that?
Yeah. Okay. So to get to sort of go to market and product market fit and commercialization, I think when you're in the seed round, when you're ready to, or when you want to raise a seed round, it's also fine to not have these things completely crystallized out yet, right? Because that's actually exactly where we come in as venture capitalists. Like, we can help you go to market, and we can help you create that product market fit and create that, what I guess we call it traction or commercial traction, right? So what you kind of want to find out when you're in the seed stage is who is going to pay for the product that I'm making. And that's, yeah, for example, in the case with Reverion that we discussed before, the biogas company, we also created that commercial traction by doing the pre-orders. Like, getting this sort of 90 million pre-order book was sort of also maybe a test to see if the product market fit was correct, right? And in this case, it worked out very well. But let's say that didn't work out, then you need to find another way to create that product market fit. Like, maybe you're not targeting the right market in that case. So let's say in the deck, in the seed round, we don't necessarily need them to tell us how they're going to go to the market, because we can help with that to sort of summarize.
Got it. No, that makes sense. And you know, like you said, it's not a straightforward process all the time, but
No, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No, I definitely appreciate that. The last thing that I would love to talk about, you know, before we sort of end into go into the ending notes of the show, what about your scientific background do you think other VCs can learn from? There's the obvious, you know, I'm knowledgeable about this technology, and we've definitely understood how that makes a difference. But what about just the ways that you learn to think? Because we talked about how VC changed the way you thought from an academic background, but how about the other way around? How does your academic background help you in venture?
Okay, how does the academic background help in venture? I think generally what you learn in academia is to think very analytical and have like a very structured way of thinking, right? So I guess the way you write texts and the way you do research is typically in a very structured way. So you have a hypothesis and you do experiments to prove or disprove that hypothesis. And I think generally, venture capital can also feel a bit as a very scattered business or a scattered way of doing things. So generally, having a bit of a more structured way of thinking, like, for example, this is our hypothesis, and we're gonna request information X, Y, and Z from the founder to prove or disprove our hypothesis. That sort of structured way of doing due diligence, structured way of doing an analysis, whether you want to invest or not. That is something that helps, I think, in venture capital, and that maybe also let's say I learned from my colleagues with a business background. I learned, for example, to sometimes pull back and not wanting to know all the details before making an investment decision. And that also works the other way around. Like sometimes some of my colleagues will tell me like, hey, sort of the structured way of thinking and asking critical questions really helped us move forward and make the right decision, so to say. So works both ways.
Okay. And so that, I think that's something that we learn very early on, the scientific method, the analytical process, how to ask questions. Um,
Yeah.
and I agree. I think you
Yeah.
see a lot of people sort of skip that step once you start to get to know a space, and that might
Yeah.
make you overlook some really cool and key innovations.
Yeah, exactly. I think also what you're alluding to a little bit, there's also a human factor involved, right? I mean, no human is perfect. And sometimes when you start acting with a startup, you just kind of fall in love with the team and with the founders, and you really want this to move forward. And that sometimes makes you, yeah, let's say makes you be a bit faster on wanting to make a decision where, yeah, not necessarily skipping steps, but you can sort of sometimes you need to, yeah, take certain steps before you say, okay, the team is great, let's invest, kind of.
Definitely. And one thing I was looking over my notes, one thing that I realized we might have to have you back on the show again in the future to make sure we can talk more about this. But the fund of funds vehicle for Extantia, that probably gives you some great insight into what funds are struggling with right now and
Yeah.
in your own operations, but also maybe more generally, what fund managers are facing in the space. So could you talk a little bit about what are the biggest challenges for you as a fund manager and for other funds in climate and in hardware?
Right. So what are the biggest challenges right now in climate and hardware? Also, maybe judging a bit from what we've seen in our fund of funds. I think generally the macroeconomic climate in the past year or year and a half has made it, or like let's say, more challenging for people to raise capital. So fundraising processes. So I think lots of founders sometimes forget that as a venture capital fund, you're also fundraising, right? So we need to raise funds yourself so that we can invest it in startups. So typically, I think for lots of funds, this fundraising process has taken longer. So where they say, for example, okay, within a year we want to have raised the fund so we can continue to invest, etc. It could take 1.5 or 2 years to raise because people are more conservative with giving out their capital. And let's say if the fundraising process for us is more conservative, that also means it will be more conservative one step further down the value chain, right? If you look at the startups, it's, for example, it's been for them also more challenging to raise capital. So that's a general challenge out there. That being said, I think from all the spaces where venture capital has an impact, at least the climate, let's say the climate or the impact spaces have been less affected by the macroeconomic changes. So that's maybe a positive thing. But it's undeniably a struggle that everybody is going through at the moment. I think you're muted, maybe, or not.
Yeah, apologies, I was
There
muted.
you go. No worries.
Some technical difficulties for the audience. So,
All good.
well, that was fantastic. I think we've gone through a lot of really, really great content. I think the biggest thing that I'm walking away with is an understanding of how it is possible to bring science into venture. And it's very much a living and breathing, I think, revolution within deep tech and climate, which is you're not really going to be able to scale venture at the size that we need to solve climate without more scientific involvement. And so it's
Yeah.
super cool to see the work you're doing at Extantia. Would love to have you back on the show, especially to see how flagship is going and all the different things that are changing the climate space. Yeah, I just love to turn it over to you. What's your call to action? Where can people find you?
Yeah, thanks, Somil. Very much appreciated. I'm already looking forward to our next conversation, just to confirm that. I think sort of a call to action, I would generally like to see more people with STEM backgrounds coming sort of out of the lab and using their expertise and their knowledge to solve the actual biggest problem that we're running into right now, climate change. So come out, use your skills, even if you don't know how to invest yet, it's stuff that you can learn. So we need you to contribute. We need you to help sort of save the planet. Yeah, it's just the type of talent we need. So they can find, I mean, obviously, if people are interested, they can find us online. So we're definitely on LinkedIn. We also have a website. So I would encourage people to reach out.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much, Iris. We really appreciated having you on the show.
Thanks, Emil. Likewise, it's been a pleasure.